and welcome to Montessori 101, a live show from Child of the Redwoods, all about the magic of Montessori. We believe that every child deserves a Montessori education. I'm Aubrey Hargis.
And I'm David Hargis. So whether you are live or you're watching the replay, and if you're live, thanks for hanging in there while we got that technical stuff worked out. Maybe you're listening to the podcast version of this. Whatever it is, we're just happy you are with us. And if you'd like to know more about our work, you can visit us online at childoftheredwoods.com.
That's
Okay.
right. So today we are doing another awesome lesson.
Yes.
Yes, I love this one. We are talking about sewing. So we're going to talk about a little craft that you can do with your kids that'll be great for the holiday season. So, yeah.
I mean, I see you with that needle there. Are you saying that a needle is nothing to be afraid of?
A needle is nothing to be afraid of.
So we're going to teach children how to use a needle safely.
That is correct.
It's amazing. Now, this is a great, actually, this is a classic lesson that we've been giving for years. We've had it in a number of our programs and so forth. And I think it is kind of interesting, right? To think like you would teach a child to use a needle, but it actually teaches all kinds of amazing skills and instills a lot of confidence. So let's jump into it. What exactly are we talking about when we say we're going to teach kids to sew?
Well, sewing actually comes in several different stages. And so this is not a lesson that you're going to jump right into the middle of without giving your child any introduction to sewing.
Mm-hmm.
But in this lesson, we are going to teach children how to do a whip stitch. Ooh. And we're going to help them make a little craft. And it could be a pillow, it could be a stuffed little stuffy, or it could be an ornament. And in this lesson, really your child is getting more like familiar with a needle itself, like the sharpness of a needle, learning not to be afraid, to be curious. Mm-hmm. And they're learning to be proficient in their fine motor skills.
Yeah. And how young are we talking?
So for this lesson, usually around, it really depends on the fine motor skills of the child. So, but I would say like this is really good for 4 and up.
Wow.
Yeah.
I do think that's still pretty amazing, right?
It's pretty young still, yeah.
You would think like a 4-year-old and a needle. But I remember as a kid going to the craft store, the sewing, the fabric store with my mom and grandma, and we would buy little kits. And they were like they were like a cross-stitching activity, paint by number cross-stitching activity. And I was pretty little when I was doing that. So I guess it's maybe a more recent thing that we would say like, ooh, needles are dangerous. And they can be, but with the proper lesson, you can actually have a pretty young child start to sew things like, for example, a cute little ornament to hang on your Christmas tree.
Yeah, it's this is something that I taught in kindergarten for years. Hello, Andrea. So glad you're here. But you could also teach your child if they're younger. I think that when it comes to sewing, it's really more about how much assistance to give a child. So really, I would totally be okay to approach a sewing project really with any age child.
Yeah.
It's more about like you being aware of your child's development. Okay. So example, I remember doing a lot of sewing with our sewing machine while our children were babies.
That's right.
And I, at one point I was wearing the baby on one of our babies on my back and doing my little sewing with the sewing machine. Now, doesn't it mean that your baby is ready to learn to sew with the sewing machine?
Probably
no.
Not.
But are they observing you interacting with a sharp needle and doing a big project?
That's right.
Absolutely.
And those are very Montessori concepts, right? Yeah. Well, all right. So for this particular kind of lesson, the sewing lesson, what kind of materials are we looking for here? Is it special needles and things, or what are we talking about?
All right. So the needle that I held up for you is actually a plastic embroidery needle, and I just strung it through with actually some cotton yarn that I used for one of our constellation projects recently. So this probably looks familiar to a lot of you. This would be like the kind of needle that we would use for like a lacing activity.
Well, this is the kind of needle that came in those little kits that I remember
Yeah.
sewing with.
Has a really, really big eye.
Yep.
So you can see the eye is really big. It's pretty easy to thread through, although a little child would probably have some difficulty with this. Normally, you kind of model for the child. Like I always like lick it and then, show them how to twist it a little bit and send it through the eye. And that actually requires a lot of hand-eye coordination. So I recommend that when you are beginning any kind of sewing project with a child, that you go ahead and thread the needle for them so that you have it all set up and they're ready just to explore how to use the needle itself. But this is not the kind of needle that we're going to be using for this particular activity. Right. This would be maybe some pre-work that you'd be doing, maybe some lacing work with something that looks like this, or maybe even a shoelace lacing through some holes. Yep. What we are going to be actually using is, I'll take it out of the embroidery thread, is this kind of needle. It is also an embroidery needle with a pretty big eye, big enough where you can really see embroidery thread can go through it pretty easily. But it also has a fairly, it's not like the sharpest needle, but it is definitely a sharp point on it.
Yeah, I mean, it could poke you. It's somewhat rounded, but it's not... it's a real needle.
It is a real needle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's metal. I like it because it looks like a real needle. And when children are using real objects, they tend to be more careful with them than if they're using pretend objects. So if you say were to do a sewing project with this kind of needle, you might not really even be super careful about touching the end or anything, because it's not gonna... I mean,
you as the adult modeling it, you might also not even be as cautious.
Might not be as cautious as an adult too while you're modeling, because it really cannot hurt you. It's very bendy and flexible, and it just
it's made for safe use.
I mean, I guess it's chokeable, so
don't get where there's a will, there's a way. So always use good supervision around your children.
Use good sense, yes.
But the idea is that it's safer,
but it feels kind of pretend, it doesn't feel real. And this, it really does feel real.
It's metal,
it's sharp.
Yeah,
a healthy amount of caution, I think.
And like you said, it goes to the concept of real things. So Montessori was and she drew that from other researchers too, but the idea of you don't give them toys, you give them real things, a real little broom and dustpan to use. Yes. It's the same concept.
So I recommend that every parent have a needle that looks like, I can tell on YouTube that you can't really tell how big or sharp this needle is, because it's just not going to come through. But essentially, it's thicker than a normal needle, but it's not enormous. It definitely fits in between my little fingers here. It's got a bigger eye than usual. And you'll find that in needles labeled embroidery needles. And the tip is sharp. You can find these where the tip is blunt. And that's also a good kind of needle to have around for before your child is ready to really work with a super sharp needle. All right. So that's what we're going to be using. You also need some embroidery thread. Looks like this. I bought ours in a big package that came with all different kinds of colors. So much fun. And if you have an assortment of embroidery thread,
maybe you also are already into sewing or embroidery,
I think it's a good
something.
Investment for a Montessori family to have.
Sure.
So
they're very pretty, at least.
Yeah, they are. They're really pretty. And I think it inspires you to want to sew with them. If you just
do other crafts, weaving or whatever.
Yeah. So all right. So you need some of that, but you also need felt, and I didn't bring my sheets of felt. I just have some felt, but I'm going to show you just some regular felt.
So the needle, again, going back to what kind of needle you need, it needs to be sharp enough to go through the material, in this case, like a felt. So it's a pretty loose
You'd want to test it first, make sure it goes through really easily.
So not so sharp or small that it would be perhaps potentially dangerous, which is very difficult for a child to use, but sharp enough that it actually can penetrate the material.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. All right. So let's see. I think that's about
Needle and
it.
thread
Needle,
and something
embroidery
to sew.
thread, and some felt. And of course, like scissors to cut your felt.
Something to stuff inside, I suppose, would be fun.
Cotton balls.
Yeah. If you want to make a
Or
puffy.
some kind of stuffing could also be a good addition, but that's optional.
Yeah. Okay. So we've collected our materials. We've got our little guy here, and we're ready to do what? So I suppose, let's get to sewing.
Okay. So before you have your little guy with you, you're going to want to prepare.
Okay.
And so this is the part that I do by myself. So you take the embroidery thread, and I'm just going to find the end. All right. And do you have any little scissors over there we can snip off? So would you snip a little off? Okay. We've got, I'm just estimating here, but we've got at least 12 inches worth of thread right here. But this thread is a bit thick. You can try, if it works for you to sew with it, then it works for you. But usually,
or the thread even, it can be hard.
Usually when I'm working, well, it's more about the sewing. Usually when I'm working with children, I will split it in half. And so you actually just take your embroidery thread and I don't know if you can see that I'm splitting it in half, and it takes a little bit of work. You kind of unroll it as you go to kind of split it, but eventually, and it'll knot up if you're not careful, but eventually it just peels off. And now you have two halves that are about three.
It's like three threads left or something.
Three threads. All right. And it's still all kind of spun together to make one thread. But this is a more manageable size of embroidery thread for a child to use for this project.
Because it's about pulling the thread through the fabric.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So, and it works well with a needle. It's just easier to handle. It's more like real thread. It's just nicer. Yeah. So, all right. So you've got your thread and you've prepped that. You're going to go ahead and thread it through your needle. And there's some debate over whether you should tie the end of the needle or not. If you tie it, I would tie it if it's a younger child, but you're going to want to test it again. Like if it doesn't go through easily with the little knot right here on the end of the needle, then don't tie it. Right. I think it's good for children to learn that when they're sewing, they need to be mindful of this little end, so they'll push the needle through and then they'll find that end again and make sure
that it pulls through and not just the needle or something.
Well, that it's still hanging on there, because it comes off really easily. And while you're working with your child, it probably will come off. So be prepared to.
Or you're uninitiated adult. I've had that happen when I try to sew things.
It just happens. Yeah. Yes. So be prepared for that. Be prepared to rethread the needle when it comes off. Yeah. And to just make that be part of the learning experience. So that is the preparation you do beforehand. I also think that if you're going to do the sewing as an actual lesson, you want to make sure you have your felt cut ahead of time.
I see.
And what I did for this is I actually just took a cup, just like a regular round, something that's a candle holder, but around a candle holder you made, I think. And then I just but I did this with a cup in the kitchen just earlier. Okay. And I just placed it down the fabric, traced around it just so I had a nice round shape. Yep. And then I duplicated it. So you've got two of them the same. And the lesson we're teaching children is to sew them together. Yep. So we're going to sew these two pieces of felt together.
And
But again, we've said this many, many times live. The most important thing for you to do before giving your lesson to your child is
practice.
Practice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are you looking for when you practice with the needle?
Well, I would think you would be looking to see how hard it was to push the needle through. Now, I don't know how to sew, so I'll be a great test case. Did I do that correctly?
I don't know.
Okay. It all comes out. I would think that you'd be looking for how hard it is to push through. I would also guess, again, I don't know how to sew, but I would be thinking how hard is it for me to find out where the other side comes from? Does it come out neatly, or does it get stuck in between? That's something I would want to know, if I was going to try and give this to a child. Is it thick enough or thin enough? Sorry, is the the thread thin enough to easily pass through, or should I like divide it further? I don't know. Am I missing anything?
No, all of those things are good. Yeah. You also want to practice the whip stitch to make sure that you are modeling it appropriately, which you are not.
I'm noticing I'm having some trouble here, teacher.
Yeah. So
I think I did something wrong. It's all bound up.
I know. So that's an example. Actually, it's actually good that you did that. I'm going to fix it for you.
Oh, thank you. I did that on purpose.
Right.
For the effort of education.
Right. So you want to practice it, and I guess, friends, you'll probably notice like my stitches are not perfect. Neither are David's, but mine aren't either, and I'm supposedly better than he is. I do more of the sewing in our family. It doesn't matter if you're good at sewing or not. You want to just practice that one little stitch, that one little skill until you're good enough at it to be able to show your child the basicness, so you don't have to be an expert at it. This is all just for fun.
Now this is called a whip stitch.
But yeah, you are testing to see, does the needle go through? If it doesn't, you need a smaller needle.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And if the thread, like it seems to be hard to pull that thread through, you need smaller thread.
Yeah, or perhaps if the extra piece continues to get kind of stuck in the fabric and wants to pull out a lot.
Yeah, then you need thinner thread. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are the things to look for. So I would have just several samples of little things that you're going to sew.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you're ready to sit down with your little guy.
Got it. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense, because sometimes with I guess for older kids, maybe I often thinking about older ones, but some of the prep you can do with the child. But in this case, maybe because you're dealing with sharper objects and there can be some frustration, and it's hard even for an adult to learn to sew. Getting comfortable ahead of time seems super important. It may not be something you want to do with the child, but instead do ahead of time.
To practice, you mean?
Yes,
yeah. For sure. And all of us have made that mistake before.
Sure.
And it is quite hilarious when you go and you teach a lesson to a child and you immediately mess up and you're like, oops, this doesn't work.
I don't know anything about
I chose lentils for this picture, but they all dump out rather than pour nicely, or,
I've never experienced that kind of failure.
So good to practice.
Now, we have a question actually. Gabby asked, how early can we start? Is 3 too young?
All right. So Gabby, what I would say is it's less about the age and it's more about the progression. So with your 3-year-old, before you get to a lesson with a really sharp needle, although you can certainly jump in and do this craft and, do most of the work yourself. But if you want your child to be mostly independent with this type of needle, you want to have another experience first. You want to have done a lot of lacing work. Mm-hmm. So, when I taught in the kindergarten class, we actually started with a sewing block. It was like a piece of wood with holes in it. Yep. And there was like a shoelace type of string attached and a wooden needle. You can find these pretty cheaply online. Yep. And we just sewed it up and then it was really like unsewing it. I was always unsewing it because the kids are always like knotted the thing up. But, something large, something concrete, this is really good for toddlers. So it's kind of a precursor to sewing. Another precursor is just lacing. So those regular little lacing cards. Now, our kids never really got into them. Mm-hmm. It was the kind of thing, I had a lovely little set at home that we used. I think it was butterflies, and they were beautiful. They came with all different kinds of laces, and our kids each did it once or twice, and then they were done. It just wasn't for them. Well, no. I mean, I think some kids really like the practice of it, and some kids just you do it and they can do it and they're done. Yeah, it didn't
captivate the imagination.
Yeah. So you also could just use paper.
Yeah, you could make that, right? You could take some thicker paper or maybe cardstock, a cereal box top, something like that, and cut out a fun shape, maybe a circle, like an ornament shape or something, and poke some, use a hole punch to make some holes in it, and then they can do a whip stitch to lace those two pieces together.
You sure could.
And
Yeah.
that would give them the practice
Mhm.
of the motion before, maybe in preparation for using something like a real needle.
Yep.
And
then
that's easy to DIY and fun.
The next thing that I was going to mention, there's all kinds of like embroidery type of fabric. There's some plastic embroidery fabric that a lot of people use. And I kind of, in the Montessori classroom, I always skipped that step because I don't find it particularly useful. But what we did use was burlap.
Yes,
and
that's a good
needles go through burlap really well. And what ends up is you just give your kid a little square of burlap, and then they just practice going in and out and in and out, and just kind of just exploring.
I think even with depending on the weave of the burlap, even a plastic needle like this would go through.
I think so.
That could be a stair step to go from lacing
usually with
to burlap or something like this.
Well, usually with burlap, I use a metal needle, but a larger one with a blunter tip.
So it's a real metal needle, but it's bigger.
Yeah. And then the same with the embroidery thread. Embroidery thread, slightly bigger needle, blunt tip, not sharp, burlap, and then just some practice with that. And even with that one, they're probably just learning a running stitch, just in and out and in and out and in and out and in and out. And that, that skill comes fairly easily to children, when they're really ready for it. And then you can just jump right on into felt. So, but if your child isn't there yet, don't feel like you can't do this project with them as a family project. Like, hey, let's make some fun holiday pillows. I remember in the Montessori elementary classroom I worked in, we made little pumpkins. And that was so fun. We made little pumpkin pillows. They were actually bigger. And they sewed the little pumpkin, little green tops on them.
I remember those actually.
Yeah, you remember this? And you could also do apples.
You stuff them with fun. Cotton balls and
just make little pillow. I bet you did do that with your mom.
Well, and I have a memory of you when you were classroom
when I was teaching making those kind of things. Yeah.
And they're great. Like, if you have if you're like us and you have a Christmas tree and you're always looking for more ornaments to put on there that don't break, especially when they're little guys, these are fun to make together and hang low so that the little ones can go and look at them and play with them. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways that you can do it, even if they're not quite ready for the stitching itself. They could do some decoration on the felt. They could help with the hanging or whatever you're going to do with it, the stuffing.
All right. So for the actual lesson, you're sitting here, you've got your fabric. You haven't done anything yet, so pretend like I didn't do any sewing. You're going to pick up your needle and your embroidery thread, and you're going to name them first. You're going to say, this is a needle, and then you're going to tell them about this needle. You're going to say, I would like to make a pillow, today, and I'm going to use this needle. It's very, very sharp. And then you want to make a point of actually like holding that needle up and gazing at the sharp point together, and just really being clear with your child. So sharp. I'm going to be very, very careful not to touch the end of that needle. It's very, very sharp. Could poke through skin. And it also is going to poke through felt. It's very, very good at poking through felt. And then you're just going to demonstrate for your child. For this one, you're going to tie a knot in the end of that fabric. And I like to start by opening it up and just like pushing it through the fabric, on the inside. And then the little knot is going to catch right on there on the inside. And that will start your first stitch. And then you're just going to start doing the whip stitch. And it's really pretty easy.
Despite my demonstration, it is fairly easy. It's true.
There's really only one way you can mess up.
And I did it.
And so you're
found a way.
You're going to model for your child what to do. You'll show them how to hold it and say, I want to be very careful not to poke my finger. So I'm going to poke it right here. Make sure my finger is out of the way. And the needle is going to come out right next to the finger. And you're just going to be mindful of where it is while you're pulling. And when you pull the needle, you're going to show your child how to hold it here at the bottom so that both threads come out rather than just pulling the needle from the top. And so that is something, so you can see how the thread is going to come right out. So whenever you've got it poked through, You're going to pull it from the bottom. Okay. And it's just going to make a little stitch right there. It's very easy. And then you just keep rounding around, being mindful of where your fingers are and very carefully pulling it through. And it's a slow process because you want to make sure that your thread isn't actually accidentally going through the stitch,
right?
Which is what happened to you when you were doing it. All right, and when you get to be about here, this is probably the time to pull, tie it off, pull it off, get another piece of thread. I usually recommend about 1 foot in length, 12 inches, because that gives you enough thread to work with, but it's not too much to be overwhelming. You don't want your child like pulling and pulling and pulling, so it's better to sew for a little bit and then tie it off. And tying a little stitch off is actually pretty easy. Usually I just I kind of push it through the thread that's next to it, kind of like this. And just make a little knot kind right there. And this is the part that you can do yourself. I'll help you. I'll make the knot for you. So I made a little knot right there. And then you can just snip it off. And then you'll start again. Okay.
And because if you did the half method, then you already have another approximately foot of yarn. That's the right size because you split your embroidery thread.
Your embroidery thread. Exactly. Yeah. So your child who has never experienced doing the whip stitch like this or sewing very much will probably need a little more assistance and confidence. So when sewing with kids, I actually literally do hover with them for a little bit and assist physically where necessary until they're really independent and confident.
This is something you might work with them for a while before you put it out on the shelf.
And also, I would recommend that you have yours and that they have one for them to do as well. And so you're working on yours and you're modeling while your child is working. And then you're okay, see how you're doing. Do you need help? I can undo that stitch for you or, whatever, whatever they need. It's a together work.
But I think actually what's
honestly, David, sewing, I think that that kind of crafting work is supposed to be a together work too. Yeah. If you think about the tradition of people sitting together, working together, doing this kind of purposeful work in community. So it's, so it's not, if you are feeling like you're a Montessori parent and you're like, well, how do I help them to do this all by themselves? Independently alone, without me, maybe this isn't the lesson to do that with. Not because it's too dangerous, although supervision is necessary around needles anytime. But it's because it's a community type of work and it's a togetherness work, and you could be working on your project, your child's working on their project, and then you can ask them for ideas about what they would like their next shape to be. So the idea is that you will be doing the whip stitch all the way up to the top, and then you're going to leave about this amount of space. Okay, you've sewn all the way up, and then you're going to kind of open it up and stuff in your stuffing at the end, and then you'll sew up, at the top, and it'll make like a little puffy kind of pillowy, and you can experiment with what you want to stuff it with. So maybe you just got a whole bunch of those, those styrofoam peanuts, and you want to repurpose some trash. Okay. Have at it, right? I know that when our last batch came, our son was immediately like, "These are biodegradable, yay!" Right? But you could stuff, right? Use it for stuffing, or maybe
a little jingle bell or something in there could be fun.
Maybe you've got an actual old little stuffed animal that has come apart. Maybe your child doesn't want it anymore. I don't know. Maybe you disassemble it and use the stuffing again.
How about something that smells nice that you gathered from the forest?
That could be nice.
We have bay leaves around here. They smell great.
Yes, you could use a little bit of yarn. I have used toilet paper before as well with kids. Just kind of wad it up and stuff.
Because if they get into this, they're going to want to do it a lot, and so whatever you stuff in there, and very likely the output, at least initially, is going to be creative.
If you want it to be an all natural fabric type of project, you could felt some old wool sweaters, and use those and cut them out. That would be a really cool repurposing activity that you do together. They also make wool felt that
Yep.
is just like 100% wool. And I remember when we had our children were very young, I had a whole bunch of wool batting just like laying around,
Yeah, that's
little
right.
tufts of carded wool that I could use to stuff in little projects like this.
That's
So
right.
you can get really
That's right.
creative. The other thing that I would say is on a project like this, if your child is already knows the whip stitch or maybe already knows a little bit about sewing, they can sew things on to the front of the fabric before they actually start the sewing project. So
Buttons,
you
other
can
pieces of
extend this.
felt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
once they get comfortable with the whip stitch, you can start to make it fancier. You can take that needle and thread and actually sew little
You could make
designs.
a little pattern on it with the
They
thread.
could embroider their
Yeah.
initial. Okay, so it's kind of endless.
So that actually brings us, as we're kind of coming to the end, like, why would you teach sewing? And in terms of like, why is it an awesome Montessori lesson?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many. Okay, so practical life for sure for your under 6 set. Um, Also, it goes with the study of humankind because it goes with adornment and crafting. So also the arts, it would be covered within this as a lesson. There's a lot of work on the fine motor skill, which are skills useful to learning to use other kind of implements like a pencil for writing. It is just a lot of fun to do together. So there's that whole aspect. It really is. Actually, it covers a lot. And it is an ancient craft. We humans have been sewing things for a long time. And unfortunately, in our modern world, we don't see it very often, except for in crafting uh, places.
Right.
But
I think I am a little bit worried that it is becoming a lost skill.
Totally.
I don't know how many adults you know that don't actually know how to sew on a button or
Or
to
darn a sock, or right.
or fix a hole. But once our children learned just the basics of sewing, and we didn't, I mean, I'm not very good at hand sewing either, neither are you. But I think that every child really deserves to know how to do a few basic stitches in
Totally.
order to fix things that they own. And after they learn
Absolutely right.
skills like the running stitch and the whip stitch really was the ones that we really focused on with them. Once they learned just those two types of stitches, they were so inspired. They wanted to fix every one of their little stuffed animals that got a hole in. And we had a lot of stuffed animals and they got holes in them.
That's right.
And also their clothes, they'd get a little rip in their pants
They'd
and they
wanna-
would run back and they'd be like, I'm going to fix this. Or I would actually find them.
Purposeful work.
I would find them with the needle and the thread, having gotten out, the needle and the thread out of our sewing kit in the family closet. And they were like sitting there sewing up their thing. It's like, wow, is that okay?
Yeah, well, that's purposeful work,
But
though,
it's actually
and we are drawn to purposeful work.
really, really cool. So the only thing
We
you
love
need
it.
to really worry about, you don't really need to worry about this sharp tip. Children really get it, especially if you impress upon them the fact that it is sharp and that it's a privilege to use, and you supervise them while they are learning how to use it. And they get to be old enough so that you're not worried about them putting stuff in their mouths. Then you can leave something like a needle somewhere for your child to use.
Yeah,
Certainly, by the time they get to elementary age, the needle should be available for them just like any other tool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, along with hammers and all
scissors and things like that.
And all kinds of dangerous things. So if you have a 2-year-old, obviously don't leave a needle lying around where your 2-year-old can discover it, put it in their mouth or stab their brother with it. But don't overly worry about that because by sitting down and actually teaching them the purpose of the material, just like when you're using scissors, these things are sharp. Knives are sharp. Scissors are sharp. Needles are sharp. They're tools. And we're going to learn how to appropriately use them.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is definitely an awesome lesson and a great seasonal lesson, I think, too.
Yes. So friends, if you make something, share it with us.
Yeah,
you can tag us
totally.
on Instagram, or if you're in our community, post a picture of whatever
That's
you made.
right.
We'd love to see it.
Yeah, if you're interested, we have a different themes on crafting and sewing out there. Like I said, it's covered in the lower elementary and in the primary curriculums in different areas, not just the sewing itself, but the product of sewing and ornamentation. So all of that is greatly aligned. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can head over to our website, childoftheredwoods.com, and we have all kinds of free and low-cost resources. If you want to reach us, you can email us at hello@childoftheredwoods, or you can leave a comment here on the YouTube channel, or you could reach us via Instagram or live chat with us if we're around.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, friends. We're not going to be back next week.
We're off for the Thanksgiving holiday.
Because it'll be Thanksgiving for our family.
That's right.
And we'll be enjoying that. I hope you enjoy whatever you're doing next week.
But we will see you in December with another great live. Hope to see you there.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.